Thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks to the two of you for writing a paper that I found very engaging to think through and think about. I will take a cue from yesterday's commentary and not really mention at length all of the things that I agree with, which include the distinction between positivism and writtenness or textualism, which I do agree with that they make. I want to start, though, by saying that I don't think that Jonathan Knapp's book is as indeterminate as the essay contends it is. And this is sort of, thinking about this brought me into a kind of meta-reflection along the lines of the severability discussion that we had yesterday, where I was wondering if part of the point of this essay is to hold Jonathan's feet to the fire and say, well, if you believe in indeterminacy, then our reading of your writing is just as compelling as one that would find you to be not endorsing indeterminacy. So I would say that how I read the book and his other writing, rather than endorsing some form of radical indeterminacy about language, that he does endorse a more radical contextualism. And I would say that there's a big difference between indeterminacy and inaccessibility, and that the book, in my view, is more on the lines of emphasizing the inaccessibility of the worldview of the founding as opposed to the indeterminacy of meaning at that moment. And I think that the figures that Chris and Evan point to, that he's referred to, including the philosophers of language, obviously are a part of the book and an important part of the book, but that more dominant as an influence is Quentin Skinner and the ideas of intellectual history coming out of the Cambridge School of Intellectual History, where the idea really there is that you can't access ideas in the abstract, but rather you have to see them as situated within a conversation that was ongoing at a particular moment in time, and that we wouldn't be able to fully understand them from the vantage point of the present with a whole different set of conversations going on now. So I'll just give an example that picks up on the fact that Adrian Vermeule's book is coming out soon. And I imagine that in 50 years, Vermeule's view of common good constitutionalism has taken over, and we have a Vermeulean view of the Constitution. And think about how people might read cases from the 21-22 Supreme Court term. What if they are reading them saying, well, this is contemporary to when this book came out, so therefore this book must be reflecting kind of what was behind a lot of the decisions in this term. Now, I think we would all say, well, that's neglecting this whole conference, the tradition of originalism, all of these other influences that have been more dominant in American constitutional law over the past several decades. And so just juxtaposing that book with a decision would not really get to the full understanding of the intellectual context that we're currently immersed in right now. So that's where I see the book going, not in a direction of radical indeterminacy. Then the another big point is about prevalence. So I don't take Knapp to be asserting that no one thought the Constitution was written at the time of the founding, or even that writtenness was that new. I mean, certainly we have the written state constitutions, we have written charters. There is even an emphasis on written charters from the early 18th century, as I've talked about and Nico Bowie has talked about. So writtenness isn't new in this context, but the question is what it meant to people and how significant it was. So how significant was it for people to think that the Constitution was written, or to consider it primarily a written document as opposed to a document that was within a larger frame of legal materials? Now, on page 19, they say about language about the Constitution, this language is simply not the sort that would be used in England. A correspondent who claims to enclose a copy of the English Constitution might be referring to enclosing a copy of Bagehot's famous book with that title, but certainly would not think of enclosing a copy of all the unrepealed Acts of Parliament, let alone a copy of moral or sociological realities that might render it a higher law. Now, I would take issue with this statement because I think that actually there were thought to be a lot of documents that were part of the English Constitution, most notably Magna Carta and also a number of acts of habeas corpus. So when referring to the English Constitution, a lot of people in England would have actually thought about the text of the Magna Carta. Certainly, Sir Edward Coke, comments on the text, and many others afterwards include that as kind of part of the scope of what the English Constitution was. So that I'm not sure there is such a radical difference between the text of the English constitutional context and then the text of the American Constitution. And to the extent that Knapp is sort of referring to the writtenness of the Constitution only being established later on or being made important later on, it's in a pretty short period after ratification of the Constitution. So by the time we get to Marbury, certainly Marshall can focus very much on the written nature of the text and expounding that written nature and think about writtenness as a key feature of the Constitution. Now, what I also wanted to mention was sort of what are the stakes of the stakes of what the nature of the Constitution would be, right? So on page 26, they say, the fact that it may have taken several years for the Constitution's textual and historically situated nature to become clear in the early Republic does not entail that it did not have that nature from the outset. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that means because I think it relates in a problematic way to the fixation thesis. So part of the, at least as I take it, part of the goal of the fixation thesis is to think that at some point the Constitution was legitimately ratified by popular acclaim and by popular sovereignty, and so that there is a kind of democratic justification for the Constitution that comes out of the idea of fixation. And so if we have unarticulated or incompletely articulated conventions, then where is the kind of acceptance on the part of ratifiers? And so I would wonder about that question in particular. Then also two more points. One is that I'm not sure that even originalists treat the Constitution entirely as just a written text. So we have a lot of examples of originalist decisions resorting to an appeal to common law principles and incorporating conceptions of common law principles into understanding of the Constitution, including in cases like Heller or in the Sixth Amendment context. And then finally, I want to point to page 43 of the paper where they talk about the propositions that are central to the ontology of the Constitution that public officials promise to follow, and the possibility of kind of surveying public officials about what the Constitution means to them. And number 7 there says that when the Supreme Court overrides a prior constitutional decision, the Constitution does not change. Now, I'm wondering what the consequences of this survey would be, because in my view, I think a lot of officials might say, actually, that's not true. We think that the Constitution does change when the Supreme Court issues a different decision. So would that mean then that originalism isn't valid, or what would be at stake there, right? So is it just because of contemporary acceptation of originalism that originalism is a valid method, or is there something else that makes it valid? So that would be my final question to end on. Thanks so much.
Adams, in his response to Paine, so Adams is just this 24-year-old punk responding to Paine. He, when it's published, it actually says, some people think this was written by the vice president, but it's actually his own kid. And one of the points he makes is actually, well, the British Constitution is all these written documents. The point that we're making isn't so much that it has a different nature, but that when you're talking about putting the American Constitution in your pocket, you're just talking about that document. You're not talking about any background principles. So, and they do this over and over and over again. I mean, the Congress itself says, take a copy of the Constitution and put it in a particular place in the archives. If people started, so if the Supreme Court stopped saying things like we overrule decisions because they were wrong the day they were decided, but instead exclusively said, well, that decision fit with the Constitution on that day, but now the Constitution is different. If the Supreme Court started saying that, and that became a sufficiently established norm that when people took oaths to support the Constitution, they meant the Constitution as it was just changed by the Supreme Court. So pay attention when we have these nomination hearings. See if anybody says anything at all like that. See if the phrase "wrong the day it was decided" ever gets used. I suspect that it will continue to get used. But if it does really stop, then how we should understand the normative significance of the oath is going to change. The normative kick, as we see it, comes from the oath. It's present consent, explicit consent by the very people to be bound. So the Democratic bona fides, all those folks are dead. They were, not letting lots of people vote. I mean, there's all kinds of, problems about the dead hand. But the living promise of the oath is really where the kick comes. And that's why our present language norms, present convention about what it is we're talking about, are important. So the earlier paper, goes into a whole bunch more detail about the normative stuff, the moral, the ethics of oath breaking and that kind of stuff. It may not have been as obvious to people initially. A lot of these indexicals, these terms that situate the Constitution, a lot of them were just kind of things that Gouverneur Morris kind of came up with, kind of rewriting things in the last weekend. He looked at it and said, yeah, it seems like what we're doing, like now, let's just talk about now to refer to the founding. Nobody was noticing that. They just sort of unreflectively thought, yeah, that's a natural way to talk about now. They ratified it, and implicitly they're situating themselves at a particular point in time, even if they're not really noticing it. And that's part of how language works. We have a language, and then, hundreds of years later, we think, hey, maybe we should philosophize about this. Maybe we should think about the nature. And that's what we're doing. But we've always had the nature, I think, as soon as the Constitution defines itself spatially and temporally. So.